Good afternoon and Happy New Year. I couldn't have imagined a better way to begin and to open up our 2013 Armenian Studies lecture series than with our new colleague Melanie Tanielian, despite the fact that the talk will be heavy. Melanie joined the Department of History last fall and very quickly has become an endearing member of our community. She's a social historian of the modern Middle East, the Ottoman Levant in particular, and is more broadly interested in the history and anthropology of war, violence, and human rights. We at ASB feel very lucky to have her on our executive committee, where she brings in a fresh perspective very much in line with this year's theme of shared histories, for grounding cross-cultural interconnectivities that shape Armenian history and culture within Middle Eastern, Russian, and other global contexts. Melanie is a product of the UC Berkeley system from start to end. She received her BA in Religious Studies with a concentration in the history of Islam. Already as an undergraduate, she was interested in the margins, in minorities, and in the Ottoman Arab provinces. She wrote her honors thesis on the Christian minorities in the 19th century in Aleppo under the supervision of Leslie Pierce, and that with high honors. Melanie just defended her PhD last summer in the history department at Berkeley under the supervision of Beshara Dumani. Her dissertation, The War of Famine, is a study of daily life in Beirut at the Lebanese home front during the First World War, where she explores the intersections between famine, family, disease, and humanitarian relief, both on the state and the international levels. Melanie's humanist concerns go beyond any particular ethnies or peoples. She is drawn to the suffering of the innocent. As she writes in a published student essay on the dog of Tidwal by the Punjabi writer Saadat Hassan Mantu, the web, even the dog, torn between two camps, India and Pakistan, and wanting to belong to both, has no voice and becomes the possession of the one that names him, much like the plight of the Kashmiris. Today, Melanie will talk to us about Armenian children who survived the genocide, a subject that has gained salience in her project with a new discovery of German sources dating back to the 1909, which bring to light rescue stories of Armenian girls raised in orphanages in Beirut. Join me in welcoming, please, Melanie Tanielian.
Well, thank you, Catherine, so much for this wonderful introduction, and thank you all for coming out on this Wednesday afternoon to hear me speak. Of course, I want to also thank the Armenian Studies program for inviting me to actually give this lecture and start off our season of lectures throughout the semester. And I've been really very delighted and pleased to be working with the Armenian Executive Committee, and it's been a great contribution to my intellectual life here at Berkeley. Wow, it is still ingrained from start to finish. I am still at Berkeley, no, Michigan, of course. So it's been really great, and I feel like I've done this just recently. So, but this is a completely different project from my dissertation, and it is based on a set of sources that I found while researching my dissertation in a small German archive in a sort of hidden suburb of Düsseldorf, which is a very wealthy suburb, I learned after spending a week there. And it was a set of sources that I couldn't resist. I just simply couldn't resist it. I was reading about German missionaries in Beirut in 1914 and 1918, but then I sort of started dabbling back into time, and I saw that these women were really active not only in 1914, 1918, but that they had been in Beirut since 1860 and were involved in rescuing children during massacres between Druze and Maronites, as well as were involved in the Hamidian massacres and rescued Armenian girls during that particular period. And so the 1909 sources that I found were just simply so precious and really contribute, I think, a new sort of story about the orphan story of in the aftermath of the Adana massacres, which I will be talking about. So the title of my talk today is Protecting the Innocent, Humanitarian Transfer After the Adana Massacre of 1909. And I want to begin with telling you or reading you a story of a little girl named Papion Asturian. Papion Asturian, circa 2 years old, from the village of Irdizlik, about 2 hours from Adana. At the beginning of the massacre, her parents fled with their children into a church. Then the church was burned. The mother was unable to flee and died in the flames. Her father, who was holding the little Papion in his arms, was shot down in the courtyard of the church. Papion was hit by a saber that left a big scar on her upper lip, which is still there. Papion has an older sister in the same village, and at the same as I, Sister Johanna, it's not me, but Sister Johanna, visited the emergency tents in Adana to collect children, Papion was admitted. A poor woman begged me to take her and said she does not have anyone who can take care of her. We found her at a river. Papion is said to have been a happy and lively child in the past. Now she is mostly quiet and serious, and according to Sister Johanna, was just now beginning to smile every now and then. So Papion's story appears in the publication called Dank- und Denkblätter aus der morgenländischen Arbeit der kaiserswerten Diakonissen, a mouthful, or the pages of gratitude and report on the Orient work of the Kaiserswerth Deaconesses in August of 1909. Her story was part of a larger fundraising campaign of the Protestant deaconate to aid children who had been orphaned in the course of widespread massacres against the Christian Armenian community in the Ottoman Vilayet or province of Adana in April of the same year. Unlike most other Armenian orphans, Papion, at the time of publication, was no longer in Adana, but now lived in a German orphanage in Smyrna, today's Izmir, hundreds of miles from her village that had been completely destroyed. This is also recorded in the same sources. A close reading of the Kaiserswerth Deaconate's publication reveals that in its appeal to the international Protestant community, the mission employed a well-rehearsed humanitarian narrative, while at the same time its practical strategies on the ground were simultaneously formative and controversial, and most importantly, highly political. For one, the narrative employed in the 19th century, the mission's publication replicated the normative humanitarian narrative of the 19th century in that it is characterized by a certain claim to factual truth, focus on the personal body as a locus of pain, and by a gendered, although slightly modified version account of victimization. Moreover, the narrative aimed not only at exposing a lineament of causality and human agency as it demanded immediate social action from its readers that would ameliorate the suffering in a faraway land, but also aimed at publicizing a guaranteed practical outlets to its readers' accumulated feeling of sympathy through the practice of child sponsorship. While individual child sponsorship has generally been attributed to post-World War I humanitarian organizations, my sources reveal that the Kaiserswerth mission employed this funding mechanism as early as 1896, thereby marking an important contribution in the development of international humanitarian practices aimed at protecting children. A much more controversial practice, however, was that of transferring children from the war zones, which sparked a heated debate over the communal belonging of child victims. In both its practices of child transfer and child sponsorship, the mission turned the future of Armenian orphans into a sensitive political issue. The mission's practices exposed two particular problems, namely the potential loss of cultural identity of war zone orphans raised in international institutions, and a commodification of humanitarianism. Both problems not unique to this case, but rather concerns that continue to be raised in questioning the possibility of an apolitical humanitarianism. I will proceed by first giving you a basic sort of background on the Orient work itself, and then move to the Massacres and conclude with a reading of the publication as a humanitarian narrative in addressing its structures and methods, in provoking the moral imagination and demanding social actions from its readers. So the Protestant pastor Theodor Fliedler and his wife Friederike founded the Kaiserswerth. Friederike didn't make it on the screen. Sorry. I always wonder. It's the translation, I think, from Mac to PC. So I hope that other things made it. I think so. Okay, so just Friederike is missing. So you can imagine this 19th century German lady. And so they founded this mission near, as I said, near Düsseldorf in Germany. And the couple's mission was to train young women, unmarried women, referred to as deaconesses. And the deaconate, the office of deaconesses or deaconate, as in the Christian tradition, is quite particular. But in essence, the work. They were trained in order to work as teachers and nurses for the poor, prisoners, and mentally ill, and others who lived on the margins of German society. So Fliedler was eager to work in the international realm, and only a few years later, after the establishment of the Kaiserswerth mission, dispatched his deaconesses to work in parishes in Britain and in North America. He was prompted by religious motives, and he was financed by the Prussian king, Friedrich Wilhelm IV. And he further expanded his mission into Palestine in 1851, marking the inauguration of a broad-lasting Orientarbeit or Orient work. Fliedler, not unlike other 19th century Protestant church leaders, was enthralled by the possibility, of course, to work in Jerusalem, the town, the center of biblical traditions. But comparable to British Protestant missions in the region, the Kaiserswerth Orient work was unwittingly entangled in 19th century European colonial ambitions, exemplified by its financial link to the Prussian monarch. However, it was distinct in that the Kaiserswerth efforts almost exclusively focused on the conversion and education of Eastern Christians and the reform of their churches, rather than attempting to convert local Muslims, which initially was the attempt of British and American Protestants. Fliedler saw a genuine possibility in the evangelization of the Oriental churches, arguing that the German Protestant liturgy might prove more attractive than the austere Anglo-American version. Moreover, the Kaiserswerth mission did not build churches. Instead, from the outset, created extensive education and healthcare infrastructure in which the German deaconesses would serve as examples of neighborly love and compassion manifested in a living faith. Fliedler advocated the education of young women and girls in particular, emphasizing the need to educate the future mothers of Eastern Christian communities. He was able to grow the Orient work from Jerusalem in 51 to Constantinople in 52, to Smyrna in 53, to Alexandria in 57, to Bucharest in 59, and finally to Beirut in 1860. Oh, again. All right, but it's not an important picture. Oh, it was an important picture. Okay. Anyway. It's a map, essentially. So you have to imagine where Adana is now. I don't know why we didn't check this before. with Natasha. I was able to grow, so he was able to grow this Orient work tremendously, and reached to Beirut in 1860 after he was called into the region based on the massacres between the Druze and the Maronites in Mount Lebanon, and he couldn't resist the opportunity to move into the region and install his Orient work there. He essentially bought a building and set up an orphanage, and after he was rejected by the local people to collect, initially he said, let's just collect these girls, and we sent them to Jerusalem, we sent them to Germany, we sent them to Constantinople, where we already have institutions, but the local population thought that that was not such a good idea. So he essentially sets up camp in Beirut and opens an orphanage. So both the Beirut as well as the Smyrna orphanage of the Kaiserswerth deaconesses refocused their attention towards Armenian girls following the Hamidian massacres in 1894 and 96. In the aftermath of widespread killings of Armenian Christians in Anatolia, the deaconesses for the first time collected Armenian girls from the affected areas and transferred them to Beirut and to Smyrna, a practice that the sisters then replicated following the 1909 massacres perpetrated against the Armenians in the Ottoman Vilayet of Adana. So the Adana massacres may best be described as a series of violent pogroms against Ottoman Christians, mostly Armenians, immediately following the anti-constitutional revolt that shook Istanbul on April 13 of 1909. The killings, although seemingly spontaneous, were the outcome of long-term processes that included the radical demographic and economic transformation of the region, as well as long-standing corruption within the local government, political infighting, an influx of impoverished migrant workers, vicious rumors, and as some have argued, the opening of a public sphere accompanied by an increasingly invidious press. These factors combined over time had contributed to a tense relation between the Armenians and the Turks, and incidents of intercommunal violence had become more frequent by the beginning of the year. So that when news of the violent counter-revolution against the newly established Young Turk government in Istanbul and rumors of Armenians arming themselves reached the outlying province, groups of armed Turks, Kurds, Circassian, and Muslim refugees from various backgrounds rushed to the street and intimidated the Adana Armenians by firing their guns. Armenians rushed, closed their shops, but nothing prevented them from being looted. A number of sources confirm that within the first 48 hours, an estimate of 2,000 to 3,000 Armenians were killed in the city of Adana alone, and there was about 15,000 were in desperate need for food. Soon the violence spread through the entire province of Adana and reached towns like Ajaz on April 15, where Armenians were killed according to the sisters' publication. The Armenians were killed according to a meticulous list of names, and then the violence spread further out into other provinces in the region. The carnage only stopped for a short time when the threat of European intervention in form of naval presence in the port of Alexandretta demanded a calming of the situation, only to flare up again with even more devastating results upon the arrival of the Young Turk regiments on April 25. The second wave of killing lasted another 3 days, during which Turkish troops claiming that Armenians fired at them, invaded the Christian quarters and opened fire. Hagop Babikian, an Ottoman parliament member who was sent into the region as part of an Ottoman government investigation committee, wrote that the killings in the province far exceeded anything the Hamidian regime had organized, in that neither women nor children were spared, and many wounded children as young as 5 or 6, according to Babikian, were found in hospitals and refugee camps. So here you see this is one of the deaconesses and treating a little boy whose hand had been cut off. The total number of mortalities is contested, but I think from various sources, we come to the conclusion that it's about 21,000. And there were approximately 20,000 survivors who had lost their properties, businesses, and families in the city of Adana itself, according to a report issued. The numbers of survivors and displaced people in the city of Adana alone, maybe around 20,000, and for the entire vilayet of Adana and the neighboring Aleppo, and here the map would be really great to show you where this is estimated to be almost 90,000 of survivors who had lost or properties and were displaced. So whereas the massacres overall have been overshadowed in the historiography by the earlier Hamidian massacres and the subsequent Armenian genocide, the massacres were widely publicized and debated in the international press and most importantly triggered local, national, and international relief efforts. Zabel Isayan, the director of the Armenian Patriarchate Orphan Committee, wrote in her memoirs that people came without invitation. Doctors and nurses arrived from foreign countries. Among them, of course, a number of the German nurses who had been stationed in Beirut. In the beginning of May of 1909, the Beirut mission received a call from the Ottoman Empire in form of a telegraph from the German Navy commander who asked for nurses to be dispatched to care for the wounded. So almost immediately, Sister Louise Januszek and Anna Helmich, who had been employed in Beirut at a hospital, traveled to Adana in the company of an American doctor and 4 medical students, also American, from the American University at Beirut. And upon the arrival, the sisters reported that there was great need for most basic things, such as foodstuff and clothing. And the Beirut station then responded by sending everything they had and what they had and their orphans could spare. Sister Januszek and Helmi soon also determined that the most pressing need, however, were those of the massacres orphans, and relayed their concern to the missions directorate or Mutterhaus in Germany. In response and drawing on previous experience, the deaconate in Germany telegraphed both to Beirut and Smyrna to prepare their orphanages for children from the war zone. The focus on children was not unique. Indeed, orphans, and although to a lesser extent women, were the subject of all aid campaigns in the region. The child was considered the most innocent victim of conflict and most deserving of protection of international and national actors. The main strategy in caring for the children was to establish ad hoc orphanages. The Ottoman government opened orphanages in Adana, in Hachin, in Dertyol, which were placed under the supervision of American missionaries until at least April of 1910, when the newly appointed Ottoman governor, Cemal Bey, asked for all orphan work to be surrendered to the government. The American and British and the French all set up temporary orphanages in the region, and the Armenian Patriarchate, by way of a special commission, arranged for orphanages in Adana, in Hachin, in Marash, in Aintab, and so on, and they were all run by local churches. So the Armenian Patriarchate was also very active in creating these temporary orphanages. But besides placing children into ad hoc and mostly temporary orphanages on site, a number of children were transferred into permanent orphanages in other parts of the Ottoman Empire. This highly contentious relief strategy has received little attention so far, probably due to the relatively small number of children moved. 25 children were sent to Rodesto, 43 to Constantinople by the Armenian community itself. And the Kaiserswerth mission transferred only 26 children from Adana to Smyrna and 37 children from Antioch to Beirut. The transfers took place almost immediately following the massacres, aided by the overall chaos in the province. And Zihni Pashas, who was the governor at the time, in his indifference in regards to the fate of the Armenian orphans, an indifference that made it possible to transfer children without the knowledge of the Patriarch in Constantinople and the Catholicos of Cilicia in Sis. Moreover, the transfer took place seemingly spontaneously and without many prior arrangement. The deaconesses neither had a list nor were local accommodations or permission papers for the transfer obtained from the local authorities. The deaconesses from Beirut and Smyrna simply gathered up needy children from relatives, in most cases their mothers, who were hard-pressed to take care of them, or from unrelated adults who had taken them up out of pity and were eager to pass them on to someone else. It is only upon the arrival in the province that the deaconesses arranged for temporary housing, travel papers, safe transport, and adequate provisioning for the children. The story of Sister Johanna of Smyrna is exemplary as how to the initial child transfer was carried out. Essentially, she arrives in the city of Adana, and she is quite unaware of the circumstances and the really horrific circumstances in the province. And she really has no real plan. She just gets there, and she is with this idea that she was going to take children. So she was met initially by a German man, Georg Lutz, who was the owner of a German cotton company, cotton, of course, being one of the primary productions of this region, who had been instrumental in organizing and providing much of the initial emergency help to Armenians in the city. He had offered up his plant to shelter people fleeing the massacres and had arranged also for this temporary hospital here. So Sister Johanna sets out to collect these children, and within a few days she was able to gather up 26 of them. Most of them were given to her by their mothers. And having collected the children, washed and clothed them, and housed in Georg Lutz's cotton weaving factory, she prepared for their transfer. So she approached the British consul, who was very cooperative in this measure. He thought this was, a great way of helping these children, and he translates or transcribes the names of these young girls into Ottoman Turkish and sends it to the governor, who then replies like, "Yeah, this is great, but you have to have the permission of the patriarch in or the Catholicos of Cilicia, and you have to have the permission of the Protestant, local Protestant pastor in order to take these children." And this was not a surprising request, considering the millet structure of Ottoman society that afforded communities the right to manage their own internal affairs. And Sister Johanna then was fortunate enough to run into the Armenian Protestant pastor on the street, who said, "Okay, this is great, but unfortunately the Catholicos lives all the way in Sis. It's 50 miles from here. The time that you will get the permission papers and then have it processed by this very slow Ottoman bureaucracy, you will never make it in 2 days to set up this mission," because she was supposed to leave within the next 2 days. But anyway, he takes her to the governor. The Protestant pastor signs the paper, and the governor gives the permission without the permission of the Armenian Catholicos, who was really in charge of the Armenian community in that region. So why exactly the governor agreed to sign the papers is unclear, but most probably it was due to the fact that the majority of the children were Protestant to begin with, or at least their relatives claimed that they were, and hence, at least in theory, were subject to the attending pastor. So the cooperation of the Protestant pastor was an exception, however. Overall, the Armenian authorities were worried about the prospects of having Armenian orphans raised in foreign institutions, and even more troubled by the idea that children were removed from their homeland. The key concern was that Armenian orphans would be socialized in state and foreign institutions, and in the process would lose their cultural identity, language, faith, which would be the ultimate destruction of the Armenian historical community. Whereas there was a seemingly international cooperative atmosphere under the newly appointed governor Cemal Bey, the message of the Armenian leadership was clear. Concerned as to the future of their children, Zabel Esayan was sent into the province with the instruction to neither let anyone remove Armenians from the homeland, nor allow orphans to be placed into foreign institutions. Esayan later wrote a warning, "Do not leave orphans to foreigners." Many days passed lamenting the passing of 27 orphans into the hands of German missionaries in the early days of the disaster. Expressing her disapproval, she exclaimed, "Such days existed." It is interesting to note that the community not only lamented the loss, but continued to demand the return of the children. So we have letters from various Armenian clerics writing to the mission in Beirut saying, "You have to return these children, and we have orphanages set up for them." So the fear of children taking on identities other than their own, other than of their own community, was not unique to this particular circumstance and also not unwarranted. As the historian Tara Zahra writes, both German and Czech nationalists in the early 20th century were increasingly worried that commonly practiced Kinderaustausch, or children's exchange between German and Czech families, would lead either to total Germanization of the Czech children or vice versa. And not unlike German and Czech nationalists in the Bohemian lands between 1900 and 1945, the Armenian church leaderships in the Ottoman Empire feared that children born into the Armenian community could be lost through education in the wrong milieu. Moreover, not unlike the inhabitants of East and Central Europe, ordinary Armenians, unlike the communal leadership, exhibited what Zahra would refer to an indifference to nationalism, as they were less worried about the children being raised within the confines of the Armenian community than about the survival of the children per se. So in response, the Armenian leadership tried to give hope, in particular, to widowed mothers in an attempt to dissuade them from giving up their children. For example, Bishop Nerses Tanielian, no relation. The Armenian, and he writes, "The Armenian nation forced the mob to slew your husbands and made you widows to understand, if the world and God forsake the Armenian race, the Armenians will never forsake their families, even if only one Armenian is left in the world." So moreover, the fear that the children would forget their Armenian heritage was not unwarranted. They were raised in these German orphanages, and they were taught in German and in Turkish. And the staff was mostly either local Arabs or Armenian girls that had grown up from the previous disaster from the 1896 massacres, and were then servicing or working in the orphanages. So, being faced with repeated violence against the community, it's only natural that the maintenance of the surviving community would take priority among Armenians. Appealing to Armenians in Cairo, Istanbul, and Smyrna, and in the Russian Empire, the Armenian leadership did not see the orphan child as a burden, but rather as an obligation to an opportunity for the nation. And in this, the practice of the Kaiserswerth sisters was utterly unacceptable. And as Zabel Asarian noted, the future of the Armenian child became a contested political issue. But the question remains, why was it that the Kaiserswerth deaconesses were eager to rescue Armenian children, and how did they garner popular and financial support for their intervention? For the sisters, it was at once a Christian duty as well as a moral imperative inherent in the expanding culture of sympathy that throughout the 19th century grew to increasingly demand humanitarian action at home and abroad. A vision of the world that was at the heart of Liedner's training that demanded empathy and action for those in need. The publication's content focused first on the successful work of the deaconate in form of reports and published letters from the women in the field. Second, it would mention their needs and a list of prior donors and their contribution, meaning that if you give money, you will be noticed. The appeal to the German as well as the international Protestant community, which would read the Kaiserswerth publication, speaks to what Thomas Lecoeur describes a moral imagination that allows us to regard the suffering of distant humans as making the same sort of claim on us as the suffering of a proximate one. To arouse a person's compassion for the suffering of another in a distant place, this moral imagination is crucial and relies on a dual process of imagination and sympathy. And according to Adam Smith, By the imagination, we place ourselves in his situation. We conceive ourselves enduring all the same torments. We enter, as it were, into his body and become in some measure the same person with him. And thence from some idea of his sensation, his agony, when they are thus brought home to ourselves, when we have thus adopted and made them our own, begin at last to affect us. And we tremble and we shudder at the thought of what he feels. In order to feed this imagination of potential humanitarians, Lacour argues images and words have to function as substitutes for the sounds of cries, for the sight of blood and mangled flesh, for the look of suffering. The Kaiserswerth publication is such substitute, whether it's the description of Sister Louise Januszek, of the wounded in Adana suffering from saber cuts and bullet wounds to their heads that laid open an entire skull, letters of eyewitnesses describing their own flight, escaping burning churches, or photographs of the ruins of Adana. The appeal on behalf of the orphan is equally a combination of the visual and of the written. The publication includes photographs of the girls that were annotated and their names and biographical details, a practice that was later adopted by the Red Cross in the aftermath of the Armenian genocide. And the biographical details, as well as the photographs of the orphan girls, serve to humanize the children, put a face and a story to an otherwise abstract and foreign-sounding name that would mean little to the Protestant community in Germany and in the international realm. So the story of little Prapion that I started with, of course, is such an example. And I think here we have the German cotton factory. These are pictures of the ruins of Adana that are publicized in this Dank and Denkblätter. This is the ruins of the Armenian church, the school, and also the subscript, I think, with these images, to come with these images are important here. The plight here, 1,200 Armenians were killed and burned, which is published in these. These are the refugee camps around Adana that are shown in these publications. And here are our Armenian orphan girls in Beirut. And when you turn over the picture, it will have numbers on it, and then it will have a description. The children rescued by the Kaiserswerth mission and lost to the Armenian community all were female children between the ages of 2 to 11. None were older than that. Gender and age played a significant role in the articulation of the mission's humanitarian narrative. While the mission's narrative follows the guiding principle of effective humanitarian representation by relying on detailed description, it simultaneously affirms and challenges the gender dichotomy of conventional humanitarian narratives that generally rely on an active male combatant versus passive female victim binary. Gender was a prominent dimension in the narrative's construction of the perpetrator, the victim, and in the rescuer or observer, and both masculinity and femininity gave texture and emotional depth to the humanitarian representation, just not entirely as expected. Following the normative discourse that circumscribed modern laws of war as they are articulated in the Enlightenment period, the mission sees women, children, and the elderly as innocent, and in their articulation would not disagree with early 17th century writer Francisco Suarez when he asserts that it is implicit in natural law that the innocent include children, women, and all unable to bear arms. Of course, this is not to say that women inherently are unable to bear arms, but rather what we see reflected in the mission's overall focus on women as innocent civilian victims is an articulation of a socially constructed disinclination of women to participate in combat. For example, in the fundraising appeal published in the German paper, the Directorate of the mission draws attention first and foremost to the suffering of young women, whose fate is described in great detail. It says, many girls were treated indecently, and then the article exclaims in bold letters, they were killed in the most brutal and cruel and shameful ways. Others were tortured by cutting off their noses or their eyes poked out and then left to their own fate. At times, male perpetrators would cut off first the girl's hands and then legs. And to further provoke an emotional response from the reader, the account is accompanied by a personal commentary. The author of the article writes, "What should I describe more? I will almost be sick when I hear these awful things that happen before the eyes of the foreign powers." It would be these innocent girls that had to be rescued. In contrast, young men were endowed with power and agency to some extent. For example, a published eyewitness account relates moments of brave male resistance, as for example in the village of Hassan Beyle, where the young men held back the attackers for a good hour. The humanitarian narrative paradoxically takes on the vision of the perpetrator, who saw in all men the potential danger of armed resistance. It presumes women to be civilian and young men to be in the position of presumptive combatants who could come to their own defense. This gendered civilian immunity norm continues to circumscribe humanitarian activities in war zones, despite the fact that male civilians are most likely to be the victims of actual massacres and mass executions. And the Adana massacres were no exception. Based on eyewitness accounts, although the killing overall were perceived as indiscriminate, it was much more likely to survive if you were a woman, a particularly older woman, or a child. Whereas the female civilian and male combatant dichotomy was upheld, the mission's narrative does not follow earlier conventional humanitarian narratives that generally refer to female victims or who render female victims as completely silent. It thereby simultaneously complicates the gendered dichotomy of active male and passive female victim. One young woman named Feride is reported to have shouted into the face of the attacker, "You can't shoot me, but I will not surrender." Another teacher named Mariam resisted to convert to Islam, and she adamantly refused. The difference between conventional humanitarian narratives that tend to render women to be silent victims and that of the mission may be explained by the position of the women in the mission as a whole. It is true that the female deaconate was based on the perception of a particular female disposition to care for others and compassion for those who are suffering, reflecting Fleetner's and the mission's gendered vision of the world. However, at the same time, within this frame, the deaconesses occupied social position that had meaning outside the frame of the family. And in their daily work, the women were quite powerful agents, as we have seen in the story of Sister Johanna, who travels by herself to Adana and negotiates with local leaders and so on. And there's also sort of the idea that these reports that come back are, of course, composed by women. So that might also render a different kind of version of this narrative. And whereas these are the orphan girls at Smyrna, and I am assuming that this is Papillon in her arms here. And there is no better version of this picture. But that must be it, because Papillon was the smallest child. She was only 2 years old. And here you see them just a few months later. So instead, it was age that mapped onto helplessness and innocence much more clearly than the female victim. The orphan girls rescued were all between the ages of 2 to 11 years old, and the female victims at times had a voice. Where the female victims at times had a voice, female children under the age of 11 had none. And if the former were to be helped, the later were to be rescued. The Kaiserswerth mission rescued young girls and set up a system of individual child sponsorship, which drew on the modern perception of childhood defined by innocence and dependency on adult care. The challenge of the Kaiserswerth Deaconate and other relief organizations of the time was to appeal to this distant suffering that was taking place down in Turkey, far away, as the title of my doctoral advisor new article on this similar subject is. The difficulty to appeal to a sense of moral obligation is universal and continues to be one of the main obstacles of today's fundraising efforts of humanitarian groups, as the historian Margaret Anderson has pointed out. The sisters utilized and took advantage of an existing strong moral basis in claiming support by adults over the child, and evoked a fictive parent-offspring relationship in their appeal to sponsors. The parent-offspring relationship and the obligation associated with it would serve to establish the moral connection towards the other, the one that you can't see, the one that you will probably never meet, the one that you don't know. By strategically placing Papillon's story as the first in their publication, as I have done here in my talk, it is used as a tool to arouse the reader's sympathy and, more importantly, open his pocketbook. The innocent and sad female child, Papillon, in need of a parent or a guardian, would pull the right heartstring and allow the deaconesses to fulfill their mission in relieving suffering and educating, if only a few future mothers of the Ottoman realm. Indeed, much of the work in the orphanages in Beirut and Smyrna would be financed through individual child sponsorship. Individual sponsors would commit themselves to pay a yearly allowance for the care and education of the child. The amount requested was 150 marks. And the mission called publicly in its newsletters for sponsors, and the sisters themselves wrote letters from the field with descriptions of the children to potential donors in Germany. Sponsors paid for this particular child until they were old enough to leave the institution, and the children in turn were instructed to write letters and holiday cards to their sponsors in an attempt to bring the imagined suffering closer and provide the guardian with the assurance that the aid went to the right place. The goal was to link donors and recipient in an intimate way that would not only facilitate the process of giving and helping, but also foster long-term relationships. In this, the practice was another example that actions at home would have effect in the world and would contribute to the expanding circle of we, as Thomas Lacour would put it. The Kaiserswerth mission child sponsorship dates back as far as the Hamidian massacres. That's where they already had this in place. And it defies the common argument that the idea of an international humanitarian effort to support the education and health care of children in faraway locales is an invention dating to the interwar period. Children International is most often cited as one of the earliest organizations that employed this practice, and there it is first in 1936. So, like later organizations, the mission benefited from the particular workings of the global market. Indeed, underlying this particular action in the world and submerged in the illusion of a personal relationship was a market exchange that reflected Europe's position in the world and showcased its increasing reach into the Ottoman Empire in particular. Well-off European sponsors had the possibility of purchasing such relationships and maintain a child in the periphery. And it may be said that the child victim of the late 19th century, of the late 19th and early 20th century in the context of the Kaiserswerth mission was an early embodiment of what Erika Bornstein in her work on child sponsorship in Zimbabwe has referred to a commodification of goodness. In this, the Kaiserswerth mission in its practice is formative, if not innovative, and again, all but apolitical. The rescue mission of the Kaiserswerth Deaconate is an appeal to the German public. I'm concluding, employed a humanitarian narrative that by 1909 was well rehearsed and proven to be successful, a successful tool in not only evoking reader sympathy, but also moving him or her into action. That was sort of the key thrust of these humanitarian narratives, to have people take action that would actually affect somewhere in the world. The controversial and innovative methods employed by the mission raised concerns that were and are not unique to this particular case and are illustrative of the potential political nature of humanitarianism as a whole. The debate ensued from the Armenian leadership's concern that the orphan would be lost to the Armenian community if taken out from their homeland and educated in foreign institutions, was not only an important and warranted concern in the context of the communal survival in the Ottoman Empire, but the maintenance of children, and in particular orphans, cultural identity in times of war was more general and clearly of political concern, a clear political concern that was taken up in the formulation of international humanitarian law. It is most explicitly stated, of course, in the Article 24 of the Fourth Geneva Convention that stipulates that the children under the age of 15 who are orphaned or separated from their families as a result of war could not be left to their own resources, and not only their maintenance but also the exercise of their religion should be facilitated and their education entrusted to a person of a similar cultural tradition. Moreover, the connection of the mission to the German state, as well as the practice of child sponsorship, which was intimately linked to and reflective of the workings of a global market that depended on an unequal relationship between the European center and the Ottoman periphery, places the German deaconesses unwittingly in the company of colonial and civilizing missions, leaving us with the question whether or not humanitarianism, however well intended, can ever be truly apolitical.